Talk to the audience for a second here. Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe, of course, if you haven't already. Just in case you aren't aware of everything that we're doing here, this is a preview of sorts for a feature that we're going to add for our patrons over on patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. And so if you ever get the chance, go ahead to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg and become a patron today. It's the first lieutenant level that you're looking for. That's the highest level of support. And as a thank you for people at that level who unfortunately, because of the daunting task that doing live video is, they've been neglected lately, and I feel bad. And so this is a way, now that we're in a better studio with a better internet connection, it's easier to start doing live videos more. Also, I realized YouTube is just the better place to do things. So there's that. So Jonathan Lucci is our guest today. We're talking about his new book, The Heavens Falling. It is a novel, and it is a big one. And we're going to get into that and what it's about, all that other stuff, who Jonathan is, what his process is for writing, etc., etc. And we'll get started in a couple of seconds. So just enjoy some more fife and drum music from the California Consolidated Drum Band as we get ready.
listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
From the Gettysburg Museum of History Studios,
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this episode of Addressing Gettysburg. And today we are talking with an author. An author, you might have heard his commercials running on the free episodes like Ask a Guide and whatnot about his book, The Heavens Falling. You can kind of see it up on the shelf behind him in his shot. And his name is Jonathan Lucci. And Jonathan, welcome to Addressing Gettysburg.
Thank you very much. It's really great to be here.
Pull that mic a little closer to you. Go ahead. You can pull it. You can be rough with it. Pull it.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. So welcome. Thank you very much, first of all, for being a sponsor of the show. And I take it you were a listener before you became a sponsor. Is that how you?
Yeah, I'm a proud patron of Addressing Gettysburg.
A proud one.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Thank you for that. All right. Your book, The Heavens Falling. It is a novel. And I have it right here, folks. And look at how thick this is. This is a thick novel. And this is volume 1.
Yes, of what I hope to be a trilogy.
Of a trilogy?
Yes.
Are they all going to be this thick?
They might be. Yeah, they might be.
You're the new John Jakes of
I suppose
Civil
so,
War.
the North and South.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
And this kind of does have a north and south feel. You're following a family.
That's right. Yep.
The family is, what is the last name? I didn't write that down. The Dawsons, that's right. And so you've got 5 brothers.
Yep.
Matthew, Robert, Charles, Peter, and Luke. And then, of course, their parents are William and Emma.
Yep.
Now, we follow them through the war. So I'm gonna guess that they all go different paths.
Exactly.
Okay, where do they go?
Well, so I just want to start off by saying that the idea when I first had it was to write a novel about the American Civil War that was meant to be sort of epic in scale. Epic meaning simply on a large scale.
Right.
So I always felt like a lot of people get very pigeonholed into their area of the Civil War, whether it's the Eastern Theater or the Western Theater. I wanted to show just how vast a scale of an event this was for that generation. And so the idea was to show, using these 5 brothers, as well as their parents, and then everyone that they come in contact with, use them to show all the different, as many aspects as I could, essentially, of the war, from the military to the political, naval, diplomatic, etc.
So that is sounds daunting to me. I mean, because I've always been told, and I believe it to be true, that a good fiction has to have a foot firmly planted in reality.
Yes.
Like a historical fiction.
Yeah,
right?
I think any meaningful fiction probably should have some
I agree.
reality to it. Yeah.
And so, if you're going to do this, where you have these 5 brothers go into different aspects of the war of the United States, let's say at that time, you've got to have at least a basic understanding of the Navy, the Army, the government. All these different things. Where do they go? So we got the Navy.
So roughly speaking, you'll have the reader's going to experience what it's like to be in the infantry in the Eastern Theater, what it's like to be in an artillery battery.
Nice.
The telegraph office at the War Department.
Okay.
Both in different ways, both river gunboats out west on the Tennessee and Mississippi River, as well as naval engagements in the Atlantic Ocean, so Hatteras Inlet, Port Royal, things like that. As well as through the father, without giving too much away, but through the father, really the political aspect of it when it comes to Congress in particular.
So how do you prepare yourself to write all of that in a believable way?
Well, I guess I should start by saying I do have, my education is in history.
Okay.
And I have loved the Civil War since as far back as I can remember, when I was 4 or 5 years old. I was the weird kid watching Ken Burns' The Civil War when the other people were outside playing. So,
Nothing weird about that.
Growing up, it was my favorite thing in the world, and it's remained so. So, I've read about it my entire life. I did some, undergraduate work. My thesis in college was on Lee's Officer Corps at Gettysburg. And so I guess in a way, I've been preparing my whole life because I've been just reading for pleasure and fun. But then when I got to the actual, okay, I want to write about this, I did have, basic understandings of these different parts of the story. But I definitely had to research more specifically as I got to each part. And really what I tried to do, and what I hope the reader will see, is that I used a lot of primary sources. So, the characters are made up, but they are placed in real units, and the units go where those units went. The naval officer is placed on a real ship that goes where that ship went. And so I used the official records. A lot of that's probably the most common thing I use to research for this book. For example, if I was writing the scene about Gaines Mill, I simply went and found, the 83rd Pennsylvania's report from Gaines Mill, as well as Samuel Bates's History of Pennsylvania Volunteers, online, because you have to be like a millionaire, I think, to afford to buy that.
Yeah, you do. Or get lucky at used bookstores.
Yeah, exactly. So, I tried to use primary sources as much as I could to make the events as real as I could.
But I mean, how long did it take you to write this?
So I started writing it when COVID first hit, and we all had to go home and work from home. I decided, well, in addition to of my job as a business person, I have time, so maybe I'll try to finally do what I wanted to do and write a novel. So I started writing it. It took about 2.5 years, but I would say large sections of that time I would not write at all and kind of go back and forth. But if I was writing straight through, it probably would have taken maybe 6 months, I would guess. So,
but now, so you're using the ORs or using really whatever sources you can, right? I'm sure. But you still, and maybe this is a difference between you and me. Maybe you're more brilliant and you are able to, I don't know. I haven't done this. Maybe you're able to imagine what you don't already know. Navy life is different than infantry life.
And I'm actually glad you asked that, because I do want to make clear, there's people who are going to read the book who, if they are really, really expert in, say, the uniforms, or really expert in the exact commands an officer would have given, you're going to find things that you're going to say, aha. Right. I remember... I've never met Tim Smith, but I've listened to him so many times on things, and I know he can be a stickler for accuracy.
Oh, yeah.
So I remember I was writing one night, and I looked up from my laptop, and I said, this is really going to piss Tim Smith off. And my wife said, well, who's Tim Smith? And I'm like, well, you haven't been paying attention to me for the last couple of years, I guess.
You don't even pay attention to what I pay attention to.
But, there are things in there that are going to not be exact, I suppose, when it comes to maybe, again, the commands an officer might give in a tactical situation.
Do you remember what it was that you said Tim Smith wouldn't like?
I think I said it multiple times.
Oh, so, any one of them? Do you remember any one of them?
I do think that when I was writing the scene on the First Battle of Winchester, I had read Earl Hess's book on infantry tactics, but I was writing it and I had the unit make a maneuver that I wasn't quite sure how to phrase it. So I just tried to describe it as best I could, and I think that was one of them. Yeah.
Is that so? In that case, where you had the unit make a maneuver, did you make up the maneuver? Like, in other words, the fact that they made this maneuver,
that occurred.
So it actually occurred.
It did, yeah.
The maneuver. So how come there wasn't something in the primary sources that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. What I've had trouble with, and I'd be interested in anybody who has a solution to this, is when you read the ORs, you read. Any of these primary sources, they take for granted things that we don't. So they would know exactly what an officer would have yelled in order to make that maneuver occur. And so, not being a reenactor, I didn't always have every piece of information for that. So I guess the point I always try to make to people is, if you look hard enough, you're going to find some things that are probably not exactly correct in terms of the commands that were given either on a ship or on a unit. But what I can say, and what I tried to set out to do, is tell a good story that has a great meaning for people about why the Civil War is important, why they should study it, what its meaning is for today from a human perspective. and to try to make it as accurate as I could, particularly in terms of units going where they really went. And when I have the characters come into contact with historical characters, trying to make those characters' personalities as accurate as I can.
So it's the same thing, I guess, that a movie maker is going to run up against, that you run up against, or that you will run up against as more people read this, is that, you can't, your job is not to write a history. Your job is to write a story.
Exactly.
It's a fictionalized story. Yep. You need to come up with compelling characters and engaging and exciting storylines, put them in these situations that's going to get the reader going, I can't wait to read more. In fact, Cindy, my girlfriend, she started reading this last week. And now we had dinner with you, so she was very interested. And when she heard that you were coming on, she's like, oh, well, I want to read his book. So you gave me 3 copies, and I let her have one. Let's see here. I said, what do you want me to ask him? And she goes, well, there are also some things he talked about at dinner that were interesting. For example, if the characters were based off of people he knows, particularly William Dawson. Also having him talk about how much he tried to keep things historically accurate, which we just did. So William Dawson, let's get into him. Are the characters based off of people you know?
No, they're not.
Okay.
At least not consciously.
Did you put yourself into any of the characters?
I actually tried my best not to.
Okay.
So I think there's always a challenge, and I think this is common for fiction writers. When you're writing a story and you're being creative, it is very difficult sometimes not to make the character yourself. I'm sure there are aspects of each character that are probably me, but I consciously attempted to make them not just like me and not like each other. One of the challenges that I found was to not let the brothers, and try not to let their personalities get to the point where it's confusing which one is which. I wanted each to have their own personality, their own reaction.
So how do you do that without basing them off of somebody? I mean, again, this is why I think you're more brilliant than I am. I would have to base them off of someone I know, right?
Yeah.
And give them that personality, and Pete would say this, and this character's based off of Pete. So this is what he would say in this situation.
My guess, like I said, is that so I did not consciously model any of them after anyone in particular, but I would imagine, like anybody else, all of the collective experiences in my life have, left their effect on me, right? And so when I'm thinking of different personalities and I'm thinking of how to shape a character, undoubtedly, at least subconsciously, it's probably based on any number of people, but there's no specific person who I based it on.
So that's interesting to me that you don't do that, because especially because you're talking with 5 brothers, and I would feel that after a while I would start making them all sound the same.
And I hope it may be that I did, but that my effort was to have that not happen.
Well, so, like I said, Cindy's really into this, and she said the big question she has is, when is Volume 2 coming out?
I'm about a third of the way through.
Okay.
Yep.
And is this self-published?
It is.
Okay, so we'll get to how you can get it later on at the end, but now I lost my train of thought. So Volume 2 is coming out. That's the thing. So while we were going to the shore last weekend, she was driving, and I took the time to read through it a little bit. And because she said, like, he's really a good writer. And, usually when, you get these things, they're not particularly good writing. But you really are a good writer.
Well, thank you.
I was reading through it, and I was reading it out loud in my bad Morgan Freeman voice, and it was very good. And I was like, okay, enough with the Morgan Freeman. And then I just kept reading through the first chapter there.
Well, he would be my choice if it becomes an Audible book.
Well, if you can't afford him, I'll do my bad impression.
No, that works too.
The poor man's Morgan Freeman. But no, so you really are good at writing. And because that's the thing, is like, when you see a book this thick and it's self-published and it's a novel, your initial reaction might be, oh, Jesus.
Yeah, no, I get it. Yeah.
Because people have sent me things before, and I'm like, but this is really good.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
And all right, so let's get into a little bit of, not enough kissing your ass. Let's get into a little bit of the story of that people are going to follow here. So the 5 brothers, they go off into different aspects of the society at the time, the war. what happens to them? Is it kind of like a Forrest Gump thing where they're witnessing these events in history?
Well, I should say, I think, so you find in the first scene, I do like to talk to people about the first scene. So the first scene of the novel, it actually takes place in the 1960s.
Right.
And it is a young African-American girl with her mother walking through a cemetery in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And they find this set of graves in this old kind of Victorian cemetery that are the 5 brothers and their father and some other people. She doesn't know who they are. But what becomes clear in the first few pages is that here are 5 brothers who fought in the Civil War, because they each have GAR, Grand Army of the Republic markers next to their grave. And that 4 of the 5 do not come home. They don't make it through the war.
So we already know the end.
Well, but you don't know who.
Aha.
So the reader is not told, well, who is it that makes it home?
Okay.
So from the very beginning, I guess the premise, so to speak, of the novel is that of these 5 brothers, only one of them is going to survive the war. Now, you don't know which one that is. You know, what will occur throughout the course of the novel is that they will each go off, as you said, in their own sort of directions. And the idea was to show as many different aspects of the war as possible. Because I think what often surprises people who are not extremely familiar with the Civil War is how vast a scale it occurred on. And then I also think people who are really interested in the Civil War get somewhat fixated sometimes on certain aspects of it. So like, I'm a Gettysburg nut. That is my favorite thing in the world. And you know, sometimes I have to remind myself, go back and read other things to remember that how vast of a scale this war occurred on. Mm-hmm. And so what I wanted to give people was a sense of that vastness of the scale.
And so we start off knowing that, okay, 4 of these guys aren't coming home. We don't know who, so that's going to make us want to read it.
Yep.
Now, for those of you who are wondering, well, what about Gettysburg? You're a Gettysburg nut. Is Gettysburg in this book?
So Volume 2 does not get to Gettysburg yet. Gettysburg is going to be a major component of Volume 2.
Okay.
And again, without giving too much away, I do want to make clear that not only will the Battle of Gettysburg obviously be a significant moment in the second volume, but a character is going to find themselves living in the town of Gettysburg for the entirety of the second volume. And so the idea is to show the town of Gettysburg before it became what it became, before the Peach Orchard and Devil's Den became iconic in the way they were. They were just a peach orchard.
Yeah.
Right? In an area
Right.
with a bunch of really interesting rocks.
And other peach orchards.
Right,
Like,
exactly.
yeah, it's
It wasn't
nothing
the
special
peach
about,
orchard.
yeah.
And so, because I've always been fascinated by Gettysburg beyond just the battle. And so Gettysburg is going to be a huge component of the second volume for sure.
Now, for writing volume 2, I know we're skipping all over the place here, but for writing volume 2 with the Gettysburg stuff, and you want to show it as the town,
Sure.
are you using a lot of your imagination, or are you actually finding sources that can shed light on that, or both?
Well, I try not to use my imagination for things where I don't have to.
Okay.
So I would say imagination is for stuff that you have to make up, like the brothers and their personality. No, I would say that the history of Adams County, Pennsylvania. I can't remember the author, but I bought it at the Beyond the Battle Museum. Is extremely helpful, I think, for understanding the history of the town before the battle, as well as just countless videos that exist on YouTube and things like that from Tim Smith or Gary Edelman. And I believe there's been some episodes on your show that have referenced Gettysburg as the town before it became what it was.
Yeah. So just a bunch of different things you're pulling together there. Now, the character is fictitious?
Yes.
Or would it be fictional? What's the...
Both, I think.
But yeah,
I think you
okay.
could use them interchangeably.
Good, I hope so. Okay, so you've made up this character, but they're going to encounter real people.
Yes.
Right.
And go, as much as possible, give a sense of what the town was like before this horrible event occurred. Right, that at the time it was an important town in some ways. It wasn't maybe as out of the way as it's sometimes made out to be. It had newspapers. It was a prosperous town in a lot of ways, but it was just one of 100 places where this could have occurred. right? And so the idea is, I think, to have this, this foreshadowing on the horizon of the readers knows what's going to happen. Obviously, there's going to be this traumatic event that occurs, but showing the town before it becomes that is something that I really want to do.
Don't let anybody approach you about doing this as a movie until you've decided you don't want to do it with me and Bo. Okay?
I promise.
Okay, good. Thank you. So, all right. Now, back to this book here. Let me just, if I may, if you don't mind, I'll just read maybe the first 2 paragraphs of this, just so people can hear what a good writer you are. This is from chapter 1, or part 1. You don't call it chapter 1, it's part 1. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, November 6, 1860. Swirling smoke sent heavenward from the glowing tip of a fine cigar had always fascinated William Dawson, since the days of his youth when he would watch wreaths of haze billow toward the ceiling of his father's study. He could still hear the clink of ice cubes hitting the bottom of a glass and the low chuckles from the accomplished men that surrounded his father, the deference they showed him plain in their expressions, and the way they poured his drink for him. Coal black, his father's eyes would stare back at them and eventually would find young William standing in the doorway. A silent nod, and some nameless figure would appear from the cloud of tobacco and close the door, leaving William standing cold and alone in the cavernous hallway. That's such a great, that's just the first paragraph.
Thank you.
It's just so, I could picture that scene. Every little bit of it I can picture.
Well, I appreciate that.
But that's a good writer.
Thank you.
Really, I mean, I don't mean to overdo this, but, a lot of the stuff I see, this is good writing.
I mean, my hope was, like I said, I wanted it to be a good Civil War book. I wanted it to be accurate. But in some ways, I think the goal should be to write a great book that happens to be about what it's about.
Yeah.
Right? Because if it's not well written, in my opinion, then you're not going to be able to get across what you're trying to get across to people. And I would argue that what I wanted to do most of all was simply show how important and meaningful these events were and are. One of the reasons why I have it open in a more modern setting is the belief that the Civil War is in many ways not over, that we continue to have to make Lincoln's words mean something, right? That we have to make it true that these honored dead shall not have died in vain.
Yeah.
And that's something we still have to do today as a society. And so, one of the things, so my education, as I said, is in...
It's not just the honored dead of the Civil War.
Yeah.
It's all the ones leading up to and since.
Right.
It's not just them.
Yes. I would say, my education was in history, but with minors in theology and philosophy. Because I went to college with the intention of becoming a Catholic priest. And then I met the woman who became my wife on the second day of college. So my plans changed, obviously.
And she was going to be a nun, right?
She was, yeah.
Yeah.
So
you scandalous.
Yeah, I know. We took a detour, I guess. But
yeah.
But I remember, we had to write some papers in college that were combinations of our major and our minors. And I remember writing about, the theological or philosophical meaning of what happened at Gettysburg.
Okay.
Right. And so to me, these events only really matter if they have a meaning beyond the buttons and the uniform and even the maneuvers of the units. And so that's what I'm hoping to show in the book.
It is interesting how we, who haven't lived through it have to put meaning to things. But if we were able to go back in time and talk to these guys who actually were in the middle of fighting this battle,
right.
And we'd be like, what do you think this means for the, the African American? Mm-hmm. And they're like, first of all, what's an African American?
Right. Yep.
Secondly, they're like, I don't want to die.
Yep.
That's what I'm worried about today.
Yep.
I'm also starving. My feet are killing me. I haven't bathed in a month. Leave me alone.
Yep.
Right. But with the passage of time, we're able to look at these things with different eyes. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to put meaning to them because otherwise they're just senseless slaughter.
I agree. I also think the Civil War is, I think, a little easier than some other historical events to give meaning to, because I do think if you read books like Famously for Cause and Comrades by James McPherson. If you read Brian Matthew Jordan's excellent book, I think it's called Marching Home, about Union veterans after the war. Carolyn Janney did a similar work.
Yes.
I think a lot of obviously when you're in situations like that, your primary concern, of course, is, you're tired and you're hungry and you're scared and and everything like that. But I think it's remarkable when you read Civil War soldiers' diaries and journals, how much they do talk about why they're there, and how much they do talk about the meaning that they give to their sacrifice. And I think that's one of the things that sets them apart from some other generations.
Yeah. So what do you think? Like, so when you look at the Battle of Gettysburg, for example, like, what do you think the meaning of it is? Like, what is that greater purpose that the soldiers weren't even thinking about?
I think that anytime you do history, you do historiography, I was always taught that studying an event and studying how we remember that event tells us more in some ways about us than it does about them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's always, I think, tricky because I come to it from a perspective as someone who is a Catholic, whose education is in theology and philosophy and things of that nature. So my head does tend to go in that direction. Obviously, for the 150,000 people who fought at this battle, it meant many different things. But I guess to me, when you study things like the Battle of Gettysburg or the Civil War, it brings up fairly timeless themes, right? Like what is the meaning of life? What does it mean to die? Is there something after that? Is there something worth dying for in this world? And I think those are at its heart, those are the questions that should be found in any of these historical events. I mean, I'm happiest in a lot of ways when I'm reading Harry Fawns or Edwin Coddington about the command study or the maneuverings of the units. But sometimes you have to remember, I think, that, there was incredible meaning in what was happening, say, on Little Round Top on July 2nd, 1863, that goes well beyond the controversies about did the 16th Michigan break too early? Did the 140th New York save the day, or did the 20th Maine save the day? They were fighting in this gigantic war that was the defining moment for a generation, that we're still living with the ramifications of today, that for all of its limitations freed millions of human beings, and was a step on the journey towards becoming a more perfect union. And I think I always try to remember when I am reading my Harry Fawns or my Edwin Coddington, that meaning is really what matters the most.
You said so many things there that were really good. That last point, though, about it's a step.
Yes.
And it is. And I think a lot of people, we want to. Me too, until recently. I see it as a step, but I always saw it as Civil War ended 1865. Everything was settled.
Right. Yep.
But it wasn't. Yep. I think we want it. We need it to be that way. Yep. But the reality of life is that it's never that way.
It's not.
I mean, and I always say this, if you just take anything that happens in your personal life, a fight with a friend or a sibling or whatever, and you may bury the hatchet eventually, but it's never fully resolved. That's always there. There's always seeds of resentment. There's scars, right? And so even though none of us lived through it, we are living through. I guess they call it the institutional effects of it still, because if there's one thing that takes forever to change, it's government, right? It's it's a very slow moving thing. And it doesn't like getting rid of tradition,
right?
And so it's it's very hard. It's a slow. I mean, you just look at civil rights after the Civil War. You always hear people say, "Well, slavery ended with the Civil War. What's everybody complaining about?" Well, they're not complaining about slavery because that ended then. But there was 100 years of oppression afterwards.
Right. And I mean, I will say that's a theme throughout all three volumes, is when you are trying to grapple with what's the meaning of the Civil War. There are many, but I think primarily the view I take of it is that it was a large and very dearly paid for step to be who we always wanted to be as a nation. And that there are two extremes in a lot of ways of viewing, both of which I think are wrong. One of which basically says that, the Civil War was not really about slavery, which is something I think is ridiculous and in some ways shouldn't really be taken seriously.
It's not.
Thankfully. Yeah.
Not
now, I
here.
would say, though, there is another extreme as well that would basically say the Civil War didn't actually achieve much. And I think the requirement
about that.
of I think to have a well-educated mind is to see nuance.
Sure.
Right. And I think that the Civil War was an incredibly large and important step toward becoming a more perfect union. One that we had to take another one in the civil rights movement, and we're trying to take another one today, right? But it's still not resolved. Whether we like it or not, our country has scars on our soul from the Civil War, from the way we either dealt with or didn't deal with race relations in this country. And so, there are characters, there are people of color who are characters in this book. There are women who are characters in this book. And the idea is to try to show their struggles to be a part of that more perfect union.
Oh God, I lost my point there again. What was it that you just said right before the end?
There are characters.
Before that.
I'll have to go back and
Damn it. Well, yeah, we'll have to just do that. Wait, maybe I could do that. Hold on.
try to show their struggles to be a part of that more perfect union.
Damn it, that's the end. Well, anyway, so I think you're right. Oh, that's what I was going to say. Was that and all this stuff too, and trying to understand the Civil War and how society treated people and everything like that. The one thing we seem to forget is that even though we were founded with these lofty goals of all men are created equal and all this other stuff, and that man is sovereign and not a king. It's we all are, and it's the individual, not the group, not the class, whatever. That's like kind of the first time it's really tried in human history.
Yep.
Okay. And B, the country is still made up of human beings. We have these really high ideals, which makes it seem like, we think that we're better than everybody, which I think we do, but not because we've achieved them, but because we're always striving for them.
Yep.
And I think because human nature is so horrible, we'll never achieve them.
Yep.
But we will always be a little better than we were.
Yes. And I think, we live in a broken world, right? And it will always be broken to some degree, but that doesn't absolve us from the responsibility to try to make it a little bit better.
Yeah.
And so, the characters in this book are very flawed, and they're not all in lockstep about what the war's about or why they're there. A couple of the characters certainly start out, the father especially, very clearly right from the beginning, his life's goal is abolition. But some of his sons are more ambivalent, as many people in the North were.
Right. So do you have it broken down? I mean, I don't know if there's a way to find this number, but like the percentage of people that were abolitionists versus people who were like, I just want to restore the Union, or other, I don't know if they did polls back then like we do now.
Well, I would say there are two books in particular that I would recommend anyone who's listening to about that stuff, and there's probably more than that, but two that I drew on a lot when it came to that question were For Cause and Comrades by James McPherson about why soldiers fought in the Civil War. And another book, I cannot remember the author, but the book is called What This Cruel War Was Over.
Okay.
And the argument of that book is that anti-slavery was a bigger portion of soldiers' motivation than is sometimes made out to be in the Union Army. But I think everyone would agree the majority of Union soldiers did not go to war to end slavery. The majority of Union soldiers would have had, or really the vast majority of people in general would have had ideas that by today's standards are certainly not, or they're racist.
Right.
However, I think the thing that I have read about many times, I think we all have who've studied the Civil War, and that I try to show, is how opinions changed as the war went on.
Yes.
Particularly as people come into contact with slavery. So some of the characters in this book, they see slavery, particularly as it exists in the Deep South. And one thing I think we've all read about a lot is the idea that soldiers who may have been ambivalent or even hostile to the abolition movement because it was abstract when you were living in a small town in, say, Wisconsin, and you didn't know slavery wasn't
Right.
in your face.
You didn't see it.
But when you see it, it changes something.
That is so true. We had, Scott Hancock, you know him?
Yes.
Okay. So we had him on a couple of years ago, and we were I forget exactly what we were talking about, but we got into talking about, perception and ideas that we get about people and everything. And I told him, I said, I had an idea about black people as a kid growing up outside of New York, and every night on the news there was another black person doing the perp walk because he raped or he murdered or he did this or he did that. And so I had a preconceived notion that I later found out wasn't true. And he said, well, how'd you find that out? And I said, I talk to people.
Yeah.
Like, it's really that if you don't expose yourself to things, or if you're not involuntarily exposed to things, then you'll never really know, and you'll just sit there with your preconceived notions that you're getting from afar.
Yes.
And, it took a long time to realize that is a slice that someone else is choosing to show me of life. That's not real life. It really happens, but that's not the majority of any group of people. Whatever you see on the news is never the majority of it. So, but so once I came to that realization, it kind of becomes addictive to expose yourself to people or ideas or experiences that you never would have done before. Because once you have that one thing that kind of just blows your worldview out of the water, you're just kind of like, you know what? I'm going to keep doing this because and that's the other thing too. The older you get, are you 40 yet?
I'm 37.
You're 37, so you're getting there.
Yep.
And I don't know if maybe you've already gotten there, but I think it was kind of around that age where I started realizing that the words of this Billy Joel song called Shades of Grey, it's not as one of his popular ones, but it's a good one. It's off the River of Dreams album. But it's basically, he was in his early 40s when he wrote it, I believe. And his whole view of everything just changed. And he started realizing, he's like, when I was young, I was so sure. And he's like, I'm not that sure anymore. Like, I'm old enough to have lived long enough to see there are no absolutes in life. It's all shades of gray. And that's the problem, I think, with listening to young people and deciding what to do in the world is they don't know shit. They haven't lived. And they're all idealistic, whether they admit it or not. That's what they are. So I don't know what that has anything to do with what we're talking about.
I would say, I think, there are characters in the book who are quite young and very idealistic.
Yes.
Right. And there are characters in the book who are a little bit older, some of the older brothers, two of whom are in the military before the war starts, that are a little more serious-minded and practical-minded about it. But I do hope that readers will come away with an understanding of the horrors of slavery, because the characters come into contact in very visceral ways with slavery in its really incredibly horrific existence in the Deep South, but also in what is sometimes considered its more benign existence in places like Northern Virginia, where I live now. But slavery is evil regardless of how severe the punishments and things may have been. And so slavery is certainly at the center of the novel, I would say.
So talking about the father, William, he's an abolitionist.
He is, yes.
Do you have, so we made a comparison earlier to North and South. Obviously, it's not a direct comparison, but do you have, they followed a Southern family and a Northern family that would be, were bound together by the two brothers, the oldest brothers, who were West Point buddies and so on. Do you have any juxtaposition there with a Southern family, or?
No, not so. I wouldn't say from a Southern family. One thing readers probably will see is this is a very Northern-focused book. In Volume 2, there will be some perspectives from the South. So let me back up a minute and say that what I wanted to do from the beginning was to tell a story that starts with a core group of characters and then spirals outward from there. So what I mean is you start with this one family. And then my idea, and to be honest with you, it sort of came from, of all places, watching Game of Thrones on HBO. It was like, you know, they tell this vast story by starting with this one family, and then all these people who they meet become characters, right?
Yeah.
So the idea is, as the book goes on and as the volumes go on, the brothers are not the only characters. That the women they fall in love with are characters. The people they fight with are characters. And so on and so forth. So there will be a little bit more of a Southern perspective in volume 2. But at least the first half of the novel is just trying to really get the reader acquainted with the main characters, about who they are, what their personalities are, and then things start to build from there.
Not to give you an idea, but I just thought what would be cool in volume 2 is if you actually follow Wesley Culp down to Virginia before the war, but then you'd have to go backwards and tie him. Anyway, it's another
there
book.
will be some real people who do make cameos.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Okay. Does Jenny Wade make an appearance? Because we all love Jenny Wade.
I'm not sure. So that's the thing. People ask me sometimes, like, do you know everything's going to happen? And I say no. Like, I have a general conception that I started with of where I want this to go. But especially some of the details, like I'm up to the Battle of Antietam as far as writing goes.
Yeah.
Everything beyond that is flexible, right? So
you don't have an outline.
I have an outline, but it's a flexible outline.
Yeah.
Right. And I have changed it at times.
You have to let the story come out of you.
Exactly.
Right? You get your idea, then you start writing, and then new ideas come, and you go, well, that takes it in a different direction. Do I do that, or do I stick with my outline?
Exactly. So
that's why I never liked outlines. It's too confining.
Yeah. What I tried to do, so before I started, so when I was in college, I was a speechwriter. Political campaigns. And so, you know, that's my only experience as a writer per se. But, you know, you didn't just write a speech, right? You first made an outline of the main points that you wanted to hit, and then you tried to make it sound poetic and inspiring and everything like that. I have, I certainly know where I want each character to end up. I know where I want each character to go, what I want them to see and go through. But as far as some of the details, we'll see.
One of the characters in the book wants to go into the priesthood.
Yes.
That
would be an example.
Wanted to go into the priesthood. Yep. Mm-hmm. Now, you met your wife, who was going into the nunhood. Is it called the nunhood? What do they call it?
The religious life.
The religious life. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then you guys fell in love and said, enough with that. We're going to get married.
Yep.
Is that? I mean, that's a little odd. Does he meet a nun candidate?
Not, no.
Okay.
So there are limited. Like that's what I mean by like they're not me, but there are parts of me.
Okay, sure.
One of the things that I wanted to do was, you know, they are a wealthy, Anglo-Saxon family, right? So today, if you're, say, Episcopalian and your son converts to Catholicism, it's no big deal.
Right.
Back then, it was a much bigger deal, particularly if you were a family that had political ambitions.
Sure.
And so to me, it was trying to think of, well, what would be interesting conflicts? What would be, interesting aspects of people's personalities? And so that was just one that I came up with.
Yeah, it was funny, because I went to Catholic school, and I was surprised as I got older to find that not everybody was Catholic.
Yeah.
I also was surprised to learn that not everybody had respect for religion or God or anything like that. And I was like,
I remember, so I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is why the family's from there.
Makes sense.
So I grew up in Pittsburgh, and I'm a very obnoxious Steelers, Penguins, Pirates fan.
Aren't they all?
Pitt. Yeah, we are. I went to Catholic school, and I grew up in one of those towns where like everybody was Catholic. I remember when I went to public high school, my rosary fell out of my backpack, and the one boy said, "Well, why do you have a necklace in your backpack?" And I realized, oh my goodness, like you said, not everybody's like yourself.
Yeah,
it's part of growing up, right?
Well, right. That's the thing is once you get out into the world, you realize that it's a vast world full of lots of different people.
Yep.
And it really is amazing if you think about the United States that we've lasted as long as we have. consider, especially post Civil War, when especially since 1960s, let's say, when the immigration policies changed and it's closed off to Europeans or very restrictive to Europeans and open to the rest of the world. It's I think everybody oversimplifies it and says, well, it's because they're brown. I think the struggle has been it's a completely different culture, unrecognizable to the dominant culture. And that's what makes people uncomfortable. And it's amazing that we have lasted as long as we have, considering all of that.
I mean, I think it's, and again, I do actually think this is applicable to the book and to the story, is I think what makes us great as a country is our ability to be, it's a cliche, but to be a melting pot for all of these different cultures. But it also has inevitable tensions.
Yeah,
involved,
of course.
Right. And so that continues to this day. I sometimes have to remind my last name is Lucci. So, I have Italian ancestry. I sometimes have to remind some of my older relatives that, people who are coming to this country today looking for a better world, who they look at with some suspicion, that was us 100 years ago.
I just had that conversation not too long ago. And I said, you think, look at the Civil War, and look at how people just spit on the Irish and hated the Irish. So I'm Irish. Yeah. And then my father had in his office a help wanted poster from 1912.
Irish need not apply.
Need not apply. Yeah. And I thought it was a joke because I was like 11.
Right.
And I saw it on his wall, and I laughed, and he's like, "What are you laughing at?" I said, "That sign, like, where'd you get that?" And he's like, "Oh, that was actually a real thing." And I was like, "What?"
Yeah.
Because again, at that time, I thought everybody was Catholic, and I thought everybody was Irish.
Right. Yeah.
Well, Irish and Italian, because I was both. And I forget who I was talking to, but I was having this conversation with someone else who's Irish, and I said, you do realize that the people you're complaining about now were us 150 years ago.
100%.
Like, we were the people that were the ones everybody was like, ugh, get them out of here, Right. But we proved that we deserve to be here. And that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing a new group come in. When you look in the Army and you're seeing Ramirez, Martinez, all these different names, that's like going back and you're seeing McCullough, O'Brien, and all these Irish names. It's earning your keep. It's earning your way into this. That's one way to do it, at least,
I think, like I said, the Civil War is a great example, maybe the greatest example. But, we have ideals that, as you said earlier, are probably the highest in the world. But we have all these built-in tensions as well to try to live up to them.
Yeah.
And the Civil War is, I think, the greatest example of that. So, what I try to show is that how important it was, but how complicated it was. There's a character who is not prominent in Volume 1. You meet him in Volume 1, but it will become much more prominent in Volume 2 and Volume 3, who will be a soldier in a USCT, a United States Colored Troop unit. Because, again, I want to show the scale of the war, not just geographically, but all the many different people who were involved with it. Soldiers, diplomats, politicians, sailors, nurses, but again, somebody who is an African American who knows the horrors of slavery and then goes to fight in this war to help free himself and his own people. Right, that's something I look forward to writing about.
So your second volume is very heavily Gettysburg. Third volume is what?
So the idea is, the second volume is going to. I should say the first book ends in late July of 1862.
Okay.
So just as the Peninsular Campaign, the 7 days, has ended, the Second Manassas Campaign in the East has not quite ramped up. So the second volume begins in August of 1862 with events like the Battle of Cedar Mountain and Second Bull Run, with the very sort of nascent beginnings of the Vicksburg campaign, and with a major theme in Volume 2 that I'm writing right now is the looming threat and possibility of England and France recognizing the Confederacy, and really again wanting to bring in that diplomatic and political themes that were hanging over all of these campaigns.
So what made your background isn't in writing, right? This is just a knack that you have? Well, speech writing.
Yeah, so I did some.
Okay.
Like growing up, so I've always loved to read.
Right.
It's what I love most in the world in a lot of ways. I spend all of my money on books, but so I read a lot, and I always did like to write. I was a speechwriter for 2 congressional campaigns in college and for a national political lobbying organization. I'm not going to say which one because I don't want to piss half the people off.
What let me ask you this about, I've always wondered this about political speech writing. You read the Gettysburg Address, right? Yeah. Lincoln wrote that. I know Reagan wrote a lot of his speeches. I'm sure Kennedy wrote a lot of his speeches, but I think he had a speechwriter. Yeah. I'm sure Reagan had a speechwriter. But they had a hand in these things. It seems nowadays that politicians don't. They just have speechwriters that write them speeches. I don't know how accurate it is, but have you ever seen the show Veep?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Okay. So I just imagine that is
more. It's more accurate, I think, than we would want to think. Unfortunately,
that's the feeling I get, especially. So like,
real life is a mix of West Wing and Veep, right?
and House of Cards.
A little bit.
Yeah. Okay. So because I
especially
think
lately.
Yes. Right. And I feel like House of Cards especially was like the dark side of it, and then Veep, because they were kind of out at the same time. Veep was like the funny side of things, but it seemed accurate to me. Like, it just seemed like a funny take on things that really happened.
Right.
The wheeling and dealing, we got to talk about this. Give me a speech about blah, 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 blah. And the speechwriter runs off. Is that really how it is?
Well, I would say it's certainly different at the presidential level, which obviously I did not get to that level. But I think any good politician, including, presidents, give a speechwriter their general sense of what they want to say.
Right.
And the speechwriter turns it into the meat of what it is we want to get across. And then the principal, the politician, will look at it and make some changes and then go deliver it. So not all leaders, right, are wordsmiths.
Right.
And part of what you're trying to do, I think, when you speak or when you write, is to convey not only information but emotion.
But wait, now let me ask you, because you say not all leaders are wordsmiths, right? Now, granted, that's true. But I might push back and say, but also not all leaders nowadays are honest.
Well, yeah.
And they're not telling us what they really believe. I think Lincoln, when he wrote the Gettysburg Address, as clever as he was as a politician and the manipulation that went into that speech, he was using tools, but he meant every word. That's what I'd like to believe, at least.
Well, I think humanity has there's nothing new under the sun, right?
Right, correct.
One of my favorite scripture verses. And what I mean is, humanity is humanity. And I think that I'm not positive that politicians today are, with a few exceptions, more dishonest than they were 150 years ago. I think also 150 years ago, Abraham Lincoln did not, thankfully, have to deal with social media and all of that. I mean, God only knows how this all would have turned out from 1861 to 1865. But I think Lincoln believed everything he said, and I think he thought it was the right thing to say to get reelected. And I think often, those two things are not necessarily mutually exclusive.
Sure.
Particularly if you want to get reelected so that you can do something important.
Right.
So I used to think of it as, look, if I have beliefs and ideals, I want this person to get elected. I'm not going to do anything wrong morally to get them elected, but I'm going to write this speech in a way that appeals to people because I want this person to win and I want them to go do X, Y, Z. I think for Abraham Lincoln coming here in November of 1863, he's speaking to the future, but he's also speaking to the electorate that he has to face a year from now. And if he loses, right, then at least in his mind, who knows what happens? Does the Union win the war if Lincoln loses re-election? I mean, many books have been written about that exact question. And so I think he saw his re-election as important as victory on the battlefield.
It is fascinating to think about. I mean, and that's the thing is human beings can be more than one thing at once.
For sure.
You could be a politician manipulating the public who also means exactly what he says.
Yeah, or at least really believes in what they want to do. They might be willing to say X, Y, Z to get elected, but they have beliefs that they want to put into practice while they're there. I certainly believe that's the case for Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
And I would say that, you know, one question people ask about, well, are all the characters made up in the book? In the course of the book, the main characters who are creations of mine come into contact with real historical characters. Two in particular, like repeatedly in contact, is Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant. And then there'll be more in the future volumes. But, you know, I think it's very important when you write a novel about historical characters, you have a responsibility to make it as accurate as you can, because whatever disclaimer you put on the front about this is a volume, it's not, or this is a novel, it's not history, people are going to, like when I read The Killer Angels, that to me, that was Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain.
Right.
That was James Longstreet.
That's good writing.
And it was years before I read actual biographies and then memoirs and diaries from, say, James Longstreet and Chamberlain that I realized, wait a minute, that's not the same thing as what's in The Killer Angels.
Yes.
So no matter what disclaimer you put there, people are going to, if you're successful, people are going to read it and they're going to draw conclusions about those historical characters because of what you wrote. So I think it's a responsibility to make it as accurate to their personality as you can.
I think that's such a testament to the power of art, because art before anything else, art is meant to touch your soul or your heart, right?
Yes.
Like it emotes or evokes a feeling or provokes a feeling from you. And that's why I think people think history is boring, but they love watching like Turn.
Right.
Like that was a popular show.
Very, yeah.
And you know, but like I guarantee it, 95% of the audience that loved that show and tuned in every week would have been like, "Oh, history's boring," but they love that show and they don't realize they're getting history. Like there was decent history in that show.
For sure. And I think history is incredibly exciting. I actually think most people do like history. They don't like the history as it's sort of taught. And I don't mean content. I'm not one of those people that thinks that teachers are teaching fake history. I just think that it's not necessarily delivered properly.
We always used to say, I had T-shirts when I first started, and I said, "History is not boring. Your teachers were."
Right.
And I took it down because people were like, "I'm a teacher and I'm not boring."
I
and
was
I'm
going to say, like, there are exceptions. My brother's a high school history teacher, and an absolutely excellent one, and he inspires his students and his kids to really care.
But he's the
about
exception,
it, right? Yeah. But I think there's a lot of teachers who don't live up to that standard. And so people assume history is boring, but you have to give people a reason. Again, I come back to you have to give people a reason to be interested. A small group of people are going to be interested in the uniforms that were worn during the Civil War or how maybe an amputation was done in a field hospital. But the broader public is not going to be interested in those things until you give them a reason to be interested.
Right.
And like I said, people do not generally start their love of Gettysburg by reading Harry Fawn's Gettysburg the Second Day.
No, right.
You have to get them there first.
Yes.
And that's why I do think there is a place very much for historical fiction.
Absolutely.
In terms of getting people interested in the importance of it. And then once, you know, some people are going to go down that rabbit hole, and before you know it, they are reading all the Harry Fawns and Edwin Coddington books and you know, Jim Hessler, who I think is probably the best living historian of Gettysburg at the moment. And there are many others, but my point is that's how you get people to go read those books.
The movie is coming up on its 30th anniversary.
Yep.
I just had a conversation last night at the Farnsworth House. I was there, Tim Smith and Eric Dorr, and we were talking about everything that's coming up in October. And I was thinking, I mean, like, you know, we're in the Farnsworth House, and the movie is playing on the TV, as it does every day, all day. And we're talking about it. And this isn't any kind of like flex or anything, but while we're talking about it, my phone rings, and it's Bo Brinkman. And I was like, holy shit. I was like, we were just talking about you.
Major Taylor,
yeah. And so the movie... To this day, I mean, there's a whole generation of us that we would not be into this if it weren't for that movie.
Yep.
And now we're old enough where we're showing our kids, if we have them, this movie and trying to light that spark in them.
Yeah.
And it is a tremendous tool. And I hope that, I think the trick to showing that movie to your kids is showing it to them when they're really young and they don't they don't have a lot of Pixar movies in their library yet because it's dated in certain certain techniques and things like that. So you got to catch them when they're young. But like in other words, my nephew who's 12, I don't think he would get into watching that.
Right.
I just don't think that there's a way that I could get him to sit down for 4 hours.
It is a long movie.
Watch that movie because it's the time between battles is so long.
But it was one of the more formative things in my life. Like I remember the first time I saw it when I was very little, and it was like one of the most exciting things in the world.
I know.
And I mentioned Ken Burns earlier. Now I watch it and I go, the battle didn't start over shoes.
Right. But then the first day wasn't a skirmish.
Yeah. But then I remind myself, if that had not been there, then I may not have fallen in love with the topic.
You have to have that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the first step, is getting people to see and to feel its importance and how exciting it is. And then you can try to make it as accurate as possible and sort all that out. I mean, one of the problems that I do have with a lot of those things is how much lost cause mythology sort of seeps into and is like this toxin that seeps into Civil War memory. But thankfully, over the last several decades, it's changed a lot.
I mean, that especially now, the crop of historians we have today, I think, are subconsciously in some cases or consciously in others undoing that. And I think we're trying to plan a show to record in December with like a panel of historians about the lost cause. Yeah. What is it? How do we identify it? And how do we get rid of it? And because I think that's important for any Civil War student. You have to recognize what. In fact, Tim and I were talking about this last night. We were talking about a book that someone wrote, and they make some wild claims in it, and Tim is like, but you say this in the book, but you completely miss the point that story comes from 20 years after the battle, when the veterans were trying to, save face or whatever the case may be. And we have no evidence from July 1st that is what the plan was.
Yep.
That's something veterans said later. And the reason they said that later was because they were memorializing Cemetery Hill. And it was the First Corps and 11th Corps guys, and they wanted to make it seem like what they were we were doing a delaying action. Right. Because they didn't want it to look like they were getting their ass handed to them.
You look at things like the 11th Corps' rehabilitation, right, over the last couple of decades.
Meade's rehabilitation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Lee's villainization.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Which I think is an overcorrection.
There's always overcorrections. Yeah. I grew up with the James Longstreet could do no wrong, he's my hero. Mm-hmm. And now I still love James Longstreet, but I realize, he did actually make a few mistakes, right?
Of course.
So there always is
a human
overcorrection. Being. Yeah.
But he wasn't a traitor to his cause. Goodness. That's the thing. Is like he was a pragmatic, cautious guy who was trying not to get his men killed.
Yeah, I mean, one of the few opinions that I've had my whole life that has never changed is that Jubal Early was just a jerk. That to me is just the answer to a lot of why James Longstreet and his image took the hit that it did, is that Jubal Early was just not a very nice person.
Yeah. He was not. He was not. Even Lee knew that. Yeah. What do you call him? My bad old man. Yep. All right. How do people? Before we get on to that, there are also some female characters in this. I don't want the ladies to feel left out here, right? With some love interests.
Yes. Yep.
Do you want to remember the story at dinner about what your wife told you to add? Do you want to add that in there?
So my wife is my biggest supporter,
which is nice,
and it is nice, and love of my life, biggest supporter about all of these things, about my career, about writing. But she was reading the book when it was about 3/4 of the way done, and she said, it's really good, I love it, but I'm afraid that people won't buy it because there's no romance, there's no sex in it, and all this other stuff. And I said, what? She had just been reading, I think it was Outlander, those books.
Yes.
Quite a bit of that.
Yes.
So I said, well, I'll get to that. So there are some scenes like that, you know, and I think it's funny. I always tell people, you know, my wife, who was going to be a nun, was the one encouraging me to put that in the book.
That was my favorite part of the story. Because when you said that, it took me a second, and then I interrupted you, and I was like, "Wait a minute, weren't you going to be a nun?" And she's like, "Yeah, but you're not."
You know, part of what I wanted to do, people say, "Well, is it an action book? Is it a drama? Is it a romance?" Well, it's all of that.
It's life.
You know,
it's everything.
I am, you know, the goal for me was to write something like, and I, this is not me saying that I'm like him, but something like War and Peace, in the sense that it's a story of a family and is in this huge life-changing event, and it shows all the aspects of humanity. It shows goodness and badness and fear and love and hate and all of those things. And so, you know, what I always tell people is, you know, what you're going to see in this book, I hope, is it's going to make you grapple with important questions about the Civil War, but also about life in general. You're going to meet very interesting people who I hope people will be able to identify with. You're going to meet diverse viewpoints in terms of gender and race and religion. And for those people who love the Civil War, you're going to find yourself on the decks of a gunboat on the Tennessee River. You're going to find yourself in an infantry line, in the Hornet's Nest at Shiloh, in an artillery battery at Henry House Hill. You're going to experience some of the lesser known battles of the Civil War, like the First Battle of Winchester or the naval engagements at Hatteras Inlet and Port Royal. And, you know, you're going to experience these incredibly important moments from a military perspective, as well as see how the political and diplomatic and even economic factors were playing above all of these things, but through the eyes of real human beings who have real emotions that I hope people can identify.
Yeah, really. I mean, you really do. And I go back to my original point. You have to have a really solid understanding of the time. If you're getting everything, societal, economic, political, you know, and the military and the Navy. That's the one thing, you know, we made the comparison North and South. They didn't get into the Navy. Yeah. Right? It was just...
I think the Navy is significantly neglected in Civil War historiography. I think not only neglected, but I think the contribution of the United States Navy in the Civil War was huge. Yep. And a lot of it
was a major part of the plan for the North.
We take for granted, for example, that Grant outside of Petersburg could sit there for 9 months because he had a reliable supply line through the James River and the Chesapeake Bay. Yeah. That's only because the U.S. Navy had supremacy on the sea. Yeah. And I think especially early on in the war, and that's what I tried to show, is there was a lot more naval action in the first 6 months after First Bull Run anyway than there was land action. And so I saw there are many opportunities to use a naval character to show those things that people really don't think about.
Yeah. How do people get a hold of this book?
So you can find it on Amazon. I published it through Amazon and through Kindle Unlimited. So you can buy a paperback version on Amazon, or you can buy it on Kindle, or if you're a member of Kindle Unlimited, you can read it as part of your membership.
The Heavens Falling. Very thick book, very well written. Any pictures? No pictures? No maps? Nothing?
No pictures.
No pictures.
I would love to do maps in future editions, perhaps. I'm not a good graphic design person, so perhaps I can find somebody who can help me with that.
I'm sure there are people out there who
good maps
hear this.
are important.
Yeah, they are. They are.
I did just, if you don't mind, I just wanted to, real quick, I know you sometimes ask people, why Gettysburg?
Sure, yes. You want me to? I'll ask you now.
Well, thank you.
Jonathan, why Gettysburg?
Well, I appreciate that. Because I'm not a scholar by training, but the Civil War, and particularly Gettysburg, has always been, a central part of my life, both because I think it's incredibly important and because it's incredibly exciting to learn about. But the Battle of Gettysburg and this town and this place, like for many people, it means a lot to me in terms of going just beyond the event that happened in 1863. Right. Like a lot of people, I came here when I was little with my family, and specifically with my mother, who I lost a couple of years ago. And we would come here so many times. There's so many pictures of her and I walking these battlefields. And now that she's not here, and and I miss her a great deal, I can come here and it gives me a great sense of peace to be in this same physical place that I was with her so many times, to go to the Lincoln Diner where we went all the time to have dessert. And, I think for a lot of people, the meaning of this place starts with the events that happen here and their importance, but then builds well beyond that. So I think it's important. I want people to know that when they come here, they're going to have really meaningful experience.
Yeah, I agree. That's a really good take on it because, my father is still with us, but if it weren't for him being willing to take me down here every year for a weekend after I first came here on a field trip, I don't know if I would be here today. Yeah. And so, when I walk around now as a citizen of Gettysburg or resident, whatever the hell the difference is, there's times where I'll see the double-decker bus going by and I'll be like, Dad, we used to love to do that. Like that was part of our trip down, get on the double-decker bus, drive around, always on top though, never inside.
Yep.
And the hotels we'd stay at, or the Dobbin House. My sister came down last weekend, a week ago, and she, her thing was, okay, then what time are we going to go to the Dobbin House? Because that's just what we did. And I was like, do you want to wait in line for 2 hours? We have 15 people in our group. Like, it's going to be forever, And they have kids now, so it's like, okay, well, tradition's nice, but I don't want to wait 2 hours. And it was a 2-hour wait, so we went out of town. Yeah. But it's not only is the history so compelling, but come here and then you create memories with your family, and it becomes a different thing.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then the final thing, I asked you this at dinner, and I'll ask you it again because I'm sure people are wondering. Has your Aunt Susan won a daytime Emmy yet?
I've been getting that my whole life. I always tell people, man, I wish I was more directly related to her. That would have made things easier in life.
Assuming she's nice enough to help you out.
That's true. That's a good point.
She might be greedy.
The one thing I'm always grateful of, though, is that she pronounces it Lucci. So
as opposed to?
Well, a lot of people, when I would meet them when I was growing up, would pronounce it Lucy. And I always be like, whoa.
No.
Okay.
Double C in Italian is cha.
Yeah. Like it's Lucci.
Right.
Right. Yeah. But no, I unfortunately never got any of that soap opera money.
That's a shame. Are you indirectly related to her?
As far as I know, yeah.
But by marriage, or how's that work?
I'm not sure. I just assume anyone with that last name that we're somehow.
There's not a lot of
we all come from this little town in Italy that I'd like to go see someday called Picentro.
Okay.
And there are actually crypts underneath one of the churches in the town from the 14th century with our family name on it.
Wow. Really?
So, I would imagine that we're from the same family
That's
in Italy
cool.
way back. But, I've never met her or anything like that. But I've certainly, every time I check into a hotel, right? Like, oh, Susan Lucci.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it's funny because what has she done lately? I think she's retired, isn't she?
I was going to say, it's almost always like you have to be of a certain age.
You do, yeah. That's pretty cool, though, that there's crypts back in Italy.
Yeah,
with
I'm looking forward to going to see those. Yeah.
I know my family history in Ireland there's not much of that there because most of them were slaughtered by the English. But in Italy, though, I'm curious about that because I think that would be a richer history that there might be some record of to this day. But
record-wise, us Italians are not very good at keeping records.
Well, you have crypts.
Yeah.
From the 1400s. I mean, that's a record.
Yeah, I suppose so. But I'm looking forward to going and seeing that. I think anytime you can go and see something historical, it's a great thing. Like I've tramped almost every major battlefield in the country. That was a big part of writing the book, was go walk the ground, right? Walk the ground at these battlefields. And my wife and I went to Normandy a couple of years ago. And then in England, we went to the air base that my grandfather was stationed at during World War II. So the more I think that people who love history can travel and go see these things, it has a great impact and meaning.
Again, Amazon.com. Yep. Also, you have a website.
Yeah, it's theheavensfalling.com.
And it's falling, not fallen.
Yeah.
And they can get the book through that as well.
Yep, they can. Right. Yep, there's a link there.
Any bookstores in town yet?
Actually, while we're here, I'm going to be taking the book to the Heritage Center and For the Historian. Good. I don't know if For the Historian does fiction or not, but I thought I would pop in and... and mention it.
Don't know if I've seen. I mean,
We're
they
filling
must.
out the stuff that you have to fill out to get it in the Park Service Visitor Center
Right.
here at Antietam and Manassas, a couple other places.
Good.
So, but
I think it's easier to get it into those other parks than here,
yeah, probably
from what I hear.
Yeah. Also, and I mean, again, the Heritage Center is a place that my mom used to take me all the time when I was little to buy me books. So
Wasn't the Heritage Center then?
it
though?
wasn't, but it was like we used to stay in the Howard Johnson
Yes.
when I was like 5 years old.
Yes, which is now the Best Western.
Yeah, exactly. And then it was the American's Best Value Inn or something. We stayed there all the time, so we'd walk across the street and go there, and my grandmother would buy me books. So to see my book on the bookshelf there would be really cool.
That would be awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I hope you do get to see it on the bookshelf one day. I'm sure you'll see it on some bookshelves, but hopefully that one, because I understand the sentimental reason for that. Really, folks, if you like history, and there is some sex in this book, so if you're looking for that and romance, definitely get a hold of The Heavens Falling, a novel of the American Civil War by Jonathan Lucci. That's theheavensfalling.com, Amazon as well, and hopefully soon some bookstores around town and at other battlefields. Jonathan, are you hungry?
Yeah.
Me too. You want to go eat?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, let's do that.
Yeah.
All right, that's it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for listening, and we will talk to you next time. All right, there's the end. For those of you watching, thank you very much for watching. And let's see, I think tomorrow Ken Rich is on in the morning at 11. So we'll be doing another one of these tomorrow morning. So we'll see you then. In the meantime, I'm going to close the old stream here. So closing in 3, 2,